Nothing? What happened? Okay. All right, we're going to get started, so can everybody sit down, please? Get that back corner. Yeah. All right, we're going to get started now. Thank you. So in this next session, we're going to have a panel talk about state legislative and judicial developments in housing in 2023 and what we expect in 2024. And I'm really excited to have Matt Gelfand and Steve Stenzler back. Stephen is a member of Brownstein's government relations team in Sacramento. His work primarily focuses on advocacy for housing, land use, and local government issues. Prior to joining Brownstein, Stephen was chief of staff to Assemblymember Timothy Grayson, and he has the very distinguished honor of being a gaucho. So, Matt, welcome back again too. He's the in-house litigator for Californians for Home Ownership, a nonprofit impact litigation organization sponsored by the California Association of Realtors. The organization works to address California's housing crisis by enforcing state housing laws and fighting unlawful policies that limit access to housing affordable for families at all income levels. Did I get that right? So just quickly, in terms of process, we're gonna have a little bit of an introduction. Then I'm gonna ask Stephen to talk about what happened at the state in 2023. And I'm gonna ask Matt to talk a little bit about what happened in the courts in 2023 with his efforts. And then I'm going to have a little bit of a roundtable with them about what they're looking forward to in 2024. And then we're going to open up to a Q&A to you all. So if you have questions, please save them for the end and yeah, chime in. So Steve took a lot of my punchlines. Something we've been talking about at the CHC this year is how the conversation has shifted from do we actually need more housing to, oh, we need more housing, and how do we build it, and how do we develop it? And something that I found very encouraging this year is to see all the really creative solutions that have come about. Steve mentioned the Sur La Table project, the Dignity Moves projects, which CHC actually had an event for Dignity Moves earlier this year. So it's great to hear about their efforts in tackling homelessness. And then also just the city's policies to increase density in the downtown core. So it's really encouraging to see that sort of progress. At the same time, challenges still remain. Each of the jurisdictions just went through their housing element process. Congrats to them for getting across the finish line or about to be across the finish line. We can give a little round of applause there. And in that process, there's an acknowledgement that there's a significant amount of housing that needs to be built in the next 8 years. And one of the reports that I saw actually this week or last week was a report that said the conversion of available parcels to housing units on the Central Coast is one of the lowest conversion rates across the state as compared to state averages. And that just says to me that there's more work to be done. So that's what's been happening locally, and now I want to turn it over to Stephen to talk about what's been happening at the state.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me okay? Cool. So I'm just going to run through a quick overview of some of the major bills that happened, and then a few case studies, and then what we're looking forward to for next year. So big theme this year was that there was major legislation in almost every sector, from the big flagship bills like SB 4 and SB 423, all the way down to zoning, permitting, homeownership. So in my estimation, we were watching AB 821 by Assemblymember Grayson, my former boss. That just said that zoning ordinances have to be consistent with general plans, and if the project is consistent with the general plan and not the zoning ordinance, it's automatically approved. CEQA, there was too much to list in one place, and we'll talk about the future of CEQA in a minute. But I think one of the most important ones was AB 1633, which would make an improper CEQA denial a violation of the Housing Accountability Act, bringing together, some of the most critical tools for housing accountability with CEQA is going to have far-reaching effects well beyond this year. It also had some provisions about attorney's fees, which maybe Chris will get to later. Permitting, continue to work on the work the legislature did last year about putting timelines around post-entitlement permits, so building permits after entitlement. Last year they covered cities and counties. This year they covered special districts. So special districts now have set timelines to respond to requests for building permits. We heard that that was a major source of delays, and some jurisdictions were using that to hold projects up, so that was a big move. ADUs continue to be a big topic of discussion in the legislature. I know from last year that ADUs have gained popularity among local governments, and so they're being seen as a tool to meet housing numbers. So this year, Assemblymember Ting, one of the main authors in this space, passed a bill to allow for separate conveyance of an accessory dwelling unit separate from the primary residence. So opening up new opportunities for funding and financing for accessory dwelling units. Streamlining was probably the biggest topic this year. As Assemblymember Ward mentioned, the Yes in God's Backyard, or YIGB bill, SB 4, allowing for streamlined affordable housing on church and higher educational properties, was a big move by the legislature. It had been tried several years before, and I'll get into that in a case study about why it passed this year. And then SB 423, which is the extension of SB 35, the state's kind of landmark streamlining law, also went through. Another case study we'll talk about. Density bonus was big on the docket this year. So there was a middle income density bonus bill by Assemblymember Alvarez, who's Assemblymember Ward's colleague down in San Diego, allowing for an additional bonus for middle income housing, 80 to 120% of AMI. Drama around that one related to the Coastal Commission, which we will talk about. One issue that the legislature is pivoting to is enforcement, and there's a lot of talk about how we've passed a lot of housing legislation in the last couple of years, but the actual follow-up and enforcement has been lacking. The Attorney General has taken an outsized role in this and has created a housing enforcement unit, a housing strike force to go after intransigent jurisdictions. So there was a bill this year that will allow them to join into lawsuits as a third party. Prior to this, they had to request the local jurisdiction to join the lawsuit. Now they have a right to do that. And then homeownership is still an issue, but still not getting as much focus as I think a lot of the advocates wish. So Senator Caballero had a bill to allow for ministerial approval of subdivision maps up to 10 units, but at the last minute, they excluded single-family zones. So that was a big priority for her, to allow for more development of subdivisions for homeownership, and it was kind of cut short at the end, so I'm sure we're going to see more of that next year. Next one. So a couple case studies here, and I think these will give an idea of kind of the issues that are swirling in Sacramento and that we'll see again in the following year. So Senate Bill 4, as I mentioned, Senator Wiener had tried to pass a bill about streamlining on faith-based properties for several years. It was held up by the labor debate, and just for background, whenever there's a streamlining provision, there's two major groups that are kind of involved, which is the Environmental Justice Lobby, wants to make sure that it's only done on properties that protect the health of tenants and homeowners, and also protect sensitive environmental areas. And then the labor, the building trades, carpenters, those folks When there's a streamlining provision, they see that as an incentive from the state, and therefore they argue that there should be labor provisions tied to that to make sure there's good jobs. So over the last couple of years, the building trades and Senator Wiener have just butted heads over what the labor provisions would look like. The building trades asking for a high percentage of apprentices and union labor. Senator Wiener saying that projects couldn't pencil with that. Last year, there was a kind of deal reached led by the Northern California Carpenters Union to provide a different standard for labor, one that provides for health care for the workers, all workers, even if they're not in the union, and for prevailing wage on projects. That was in AB 2011, you might remember. So that standard has now moved forward and been adopted in several of the streamlining bills, and that basically allowed this one to get through this year. For projects over 50 units, those standards now apply. The issue with the environmental justice community has not really been resolved, and as this bill made its way through the process, it was narrowed down further and further, excluding sites like sites in wildfire areas, sites in the coastal zone, sites near industrial areas, and basically the laundry list of exclusions that kind of happen on streamlining bills, to the point where the Natural Resources Committee forced a pretty big amendment at the end of the session and got them to cut out like a pretty significant chunk of the eligible areas. So that tension is still on full display. There's new leadership in the Assembly, a new chair of the Natural Resources Committee, so folks are looking towards that, how they're going to handle that tension moving forward. The new chair is Assemblymember Isaac Bryan, who's from LA. He's known as, I'd say, a YIMBY. He's pretty pro-housing, so folks are watching that closely. Next one. Senate Bill 423, SB 35 extension, probably the biggest focus for housing advocates. Despite all the issues with SB 35, and I heard it mentioned in the previous presentation about prevailing wage and the labor requirements, making it difficult. Senator Wiener came back and decided that he was going to extend this as SB 35 was sunsetting and try to address some of those affordability issues. So it did expand the streamlining provisions. It made a small inroad into the coastal zone. So SB 423 does apply in some areas of the coastal zone, but it's limited by areas that are going to be affected by sea level rise. But the fact that the coastal zone was breached at all was a major development in the legislature and something that is going to be a big issue next year. And then fire zones, this is kind of a new standard that he's been working on, basically where if the jurisdiction has an adopted fire plan, then they can still build in some of those zones. That was a hot topic of contention, and that's going to be fleshed out again next year. And then on the labor issue, this is another one where the building trades and their labor provisions and the carpenters' labor provisions were kind of in conflict. They did reach a bargain at the end of the year, which was that on projects over 85 feet, the building trades, skilled and trained, apprenticeship standards were going to apply. Below 85 feet would be the healthcare and prevailing wage. And so basically that was considered to be projects that are largely going to be steel construction over 85 feet and then timber construction below 85 feet. And so that was kind of a uneasy truce there where the trades would take the bigger projects, carpenters would take the smaller projects. And that did advance, and so folks are very hopeful that this could be a potential template for future labor deals with housing bills. I want to highlight a bill that will be actually on the ballot potentially next year. So ACA 1 is a long-term project by Assemblymember Aguiar Curry, who is the chair of the Local Government Committee about local government financing. So this is a constitutional amendment, so it's going to go to the voters to lower the threshold for certain new taxes for housing and infrastructure to 55%. It was raised to 2/3 by Prop 13, and this has been seen as like a major barrier to building infrastructure for local governments. It's also had unintended consequences of shifting the burden of paying for infrastructure to new housing because local governments, because they couldn't recoup enough through property taxes to actually pay for the services, started using impact fees. And we've done a lot of work around impact fees and feasibility, but we know that local governments have to get the money to pay for infrastructure somehow, and that they put it onto the developers. But this exacerbates many aspects of the housing crisis that we're very familiar with, which is that new homeowners are paying more, subsidizing older homeowners who have their rates capped and aren't paying impact fees. So a lot of equity issues there, a lot of real issues for cities. So there's a large coalition that's building around ACA1. It's not going to be on the March ballot, but they're looking for November. They are going to do some tweaks to it this year. So, if that's something that's important to you guys, definitely I would weigh in, because there's going to be discussions about, what can the funding be used for? What are the restrictions around it? Something I've proposed is that, if local governments are going to raise their taxes to pay for infrastructure, then there should be a concomitant lowering of the fees on new housing. That's just me. Yeah, next one. This one, not a huge bill, probably didn't hear about it, but I think it was just an interesting case study kind of showing that a lot of the big issues, like the streamlining, have been addressed, and now legislators are looking into more of the details, the things that really are further down on the pro forma but still affect developers. So there was a bill last year that put the timelines on cities for post-entitlement permits. So your building permits, grading permits, that kind of thing. San Francisco, in its infinite wisdom, does not have ministerial building permits. They're discretionary. They can actually, it's in their constitution, they can actually go and appeal any building permit that a project has. And you know that there are a lot of those. And so every step of the way, there could be an appeal and a judicial decision, all this. So San Francisco member actually went in and fixed this one little issue to say that San Francisco has to issue these building permits ministerially, and they have to comply with the timelines. So between this bill and many other bills and a lot of focus specifically on San Francisco by the legislature, they may actually have to build some housing now. I'm qualifying that as a may. And just looking ahead, we'll talk more in depth about this, but I just wanted to point out, as Assemblyman Ward mentioned, there's going to be a bond measure for affordable housing. Other things on the ballot, like ACA1, are going to be a big issue. So it's going to be big coalitions working, on a statewide ballot measure like that. Homelessness continues to be a large issue. We've seen a lot of reforms come through in the last year. The governor has his bond on the ballot. There's been major legislation about the circumstances in which people can be considered gravely disabled and have treatment. And so although it's moving slowly, there is movement towards a comprehensive solution to homelessness. Coastal zone, probably going to be the hottest topic next year. As I mentioned with SB 423, there was some inroad made into streamlining the coastal zone, but at the same time, AB 1287, the middle income density bonus bill, originally applied in the coastal zone, but was amended to say that the two had to harmonize with each other. But this is like harmonizing of a bully and then someone who has no power. So the coastal zone is going to basically supersede that in most people's estimation. So that member, Assemblymember Alvarez, is likely to come back. There's a few legislators who are kind of convening folks to make a real run at harmonizing in a real way the Coastal Commission and then all of the laws like the Housing Accountability Act, the density bonus law that the state has put forward to streamline housing. Impact fees continue to be a big issue. As I mentioned, with ACA1 on the horizon, folks are thinking about how impact fees are affecting the feasibility of housing. You may be familiar with the Sheets decision that the Supreme Court may take up, which has the potential to really change the way that cities can assess impact fees. So folks think there's an opportunity there for maybe a grand bargain with working with cities and ACA1 to fund infrastructure, but also to allow new housing to be built and not put the burden all on new homeowners. And just some of the ideas that are floating around on impact fees are deferral until the certificate of occupancy is issued, waiving fees on 100% affordable projects, and then looking at feasibility as a metric for whether fees will pass the Nexus study test. Construction defect liability. I don't know if we have any condo developers here, but there's not that many left in the state, and a large reason is because of construction defect liability. In many other countries, Canada, for example, they built a lot of condos. They changed their liability regime to more of like a home warranty program, and that spurred a lot of development of condos. So folks that are looking in the homeownership space and allowing people to, get on the housing ladder by owning a condo are really focused on construction defect liability. This is a multi-year issue and probably something that we might see a little bit this year, but next year, but it's going to take a long time to really mature, but it's something that's on the horizon. And then finally, CEQA. The governor passed a CEQA reform for various types of infrastructure, for rail and energy and things like that. He left out housing. A lot of the housing advocates were a little chagrined by that. But I think that there's an opportunity for them to look at the model that the governor advanced and move towards more of a grand bargain instead of the one-offs that we see. We obviously see arenas and certain projects get CEQA exemptions. Now that the labor issue is kind of being resolved, there's a potential for folks to come together and really address CEQA in a holistic way. So just a couple things to do next year.
If you have any grand ideas, he's your guy. All right, Matt, you want to take it away?
Yeah, why don't you give me the...
You want the mic?
No, the clicker.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm going to try to move my mic a little bit. I'm going to try to move a little bit quickly. People like to grill me with questions, at least most of the time, so I want to leave plenty of room for that, especially in this, this audience. I work for an organization called Californians for Homeownership. It's a 501c3 organization formed by the California Association of Realtors, receives almost all of its financial and operational support from CAR and from local associations of realtors, including Santa Barbara Association of Realtors, who's been very supportive. What we do, a few years ago, the realtors, sort of watching the model that was happening in the Bay Area with Sonia Traus and organizations up there, figured, hey, we're working in the legislature to get these bills passed, and then local jurisdictions are ignoring them. And so we're spending a lot of money, and we could spend a little bit more money to make those bills actually have some teeth in the form of litigation. So they formed an organization and then hired me to run it. We do impact litigation. We sue, generally, cities and counties that don't comply with state housing law. Although we also have tried more and more to intervene on behalf of cities and counties when they're sued in CEQA lawsuits, which is now, our aim is to get that to be 30 or 40% of what we do. But the courts have not been very charitable to us. We've had limited success. Courts have said, hey, there's already the project opponents, the city or county, and the developer in this case. What the hell are you going to say that these other people are not going to say? We think we do have something to say that the developer and cities are unlikely to say, and we've been successful in one case in intervening and then making arguments that the court relied on. But in most cases, we've been told to pound sand. So we want to keep doing that, but the reality is that most of our litigation is going to be against cities and counties, unfortunately. So I want to talk a little bit, and this will lead up to my summary of the court cases that have come at the trial level in the housing space this year, which has been significantly our cases. We've focused this last year and a half on housing element litigation. Last time I was here, I was kind of telling you about what we were going to do. Well, now we've done it. Our focus in all of our cases, but especially in our housing element cases, is on very simple cases to enforce rules that other folks are choosing not to enforce. Housing litigation has traditionally been done by equity groups that build, and this isn't to disparage them, but they build large cases with lots of causes of action, often with multiple municipal defendants, with the goal of really getting a big settlement out of a city to do a lot of promises about that city's future housing, especially deed-restricted affordable housing. Our focus has been a little bit different. We have focused on issues where our perception is that cities and counties feel that some of these rules are optional or can be complied with in a sort of lackadaisical fashion, and we've tried to push an attitudinal shift. We also are very focused on establishing the applicability of the builder's remedy in cities and counties that have not complied with housing element law during their periods of non-compliance. A lot of folks have said, well, why do you care? The developers will litigate that in the future. Sure. We'd rather have developers focus on litigating the other aspects of the builder's remedy rather than trying to litigate whether or not the city was out of compliance at a particular moment. And when we sent letters to cities and counties over the last year asking them to simply confirm that the builder's remedy applies because they have yet to adopt a housing element, most of them have declined to do so. And so we sued 20 of those cities. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that has gone. Give you a little bit of background on some of the issues that we have focused on. We've focused on the housing element deadlines. To us, those deadlines are real, and they are real as of the deadline, not 120 days out or a year out or some of the other myths that have gone on about when the housing elements are due. We've focused on the rezoning deadlines, which follow the housing element deadlines. For most cities and counties, they follow them by 1 year because most cities and counties do not timely adopt their housing element, so they have to do their rezoning within 1 year of the housing element deadline. We've focused on the requirement to have realistic capacity in the housing element, to calculate the realistic capacity using certain criteria that are in the government code. And we've also focused very significantly on the use of non-vacant sites in housing element sites inventories, and in particular, on the requirement for cities that rely on non-vacant sites for most of their uses, for most of their low-income housing, to put forward evidence that the existing sites on those sites inventories are likely to have their existing uses discontinued. So our goal with these lawsuits has been to give cities two options and to force them into a choice. Option one has been to settle with us, and we've obtained a lot of settlements. Those settlements generally take the form of a stipulated judgment where the city loses the case, agrees to lose the case, with the judge declaring that the city is out of compliance, or county, and declaring that the builder's remedy applies in that city or county, setting a specific timeline, and we've been pretty flexible about letting cities and counties negotiate extensions to those timelines, and the cities and counties like this, if you lose a housing element lawsuit, and these cities have lost, then you are subject to a CEQA exemption for your entire housing element process. And some people believe that that applies to the rezoning subsequent to housing element process as well. So we always have the stipulated judgments in these cases recite that the housing element process is CEQA exempt. And we've also had some of these cities make promises about the substance of their housing element and also about application processing in the city for builder's remedy projects. We've had to litigate some of these cases all the way to judgment, and we've attempted to do so very quickly. The law creates a preference for these cases. They are subject to a preference over all other civil actions, both at the trial level and appeal. And we've managed to get some courts to take that preference seriously, including all of the writs departments in the Los Angeles Superior Court, which has been a big deal for us. So you'll see that once the cases get to issue, once we've amended our petition and gotten to the point where we're litigating the case for real, we've generally litigated these cases in 3 or 4 months. And the 3 cases that we've litigated to trial, we've won. So I can talk about them very quickly, because they do tell some lessons about how housing elements are supposed to work. And I think they tell some lessons that even if you obtain HCD certification, it's no promise that some of these issues aren't in your housing elements. So in Beverly Hills, the city relied on this mixed-use overlay zone to make up its entire low-income and most of its market rate housing inventory. They did so using a one-size-fits-all approach to calculating unit counts. So they assumed maximum permitted density on every single site, regardless of what was there, and regardless of other site constraints. And importantly, regardless of whether the site was subject to a 3, 4, or 5 floor height limit. The maximum height limit in the city is 5 floors, and they were assuming 79 units per acre for all of their sites. The city also did not really put forward any evidence for discontinuation of use on its non-vacant sites, ultimately saying that they expected most of those sites to be office conversions. This is some of the most valuable office real estate in Los Angeles. And they said that it was all going to be converted to housing, but they calculated the unit counts not based on the size and structure of the existing structures on the parcel. They calculated based on a blank canvas development. Completely ridiculous approach. The city argued that the case would be moot soon because they were working on it, which is something that we're very familiar with. The city, or the court, really rejected every single argument that the city made. The court faulted the city for not connecting its unit count metrics with either development standards or the parcels, on the parcels they said were conversions, the actual structure of the existing buildings. And the court also faulted the city for not putting evidence in the record before the city council at the time of its decision that these sites were likely to be discontinued, the existing uses were likely to be discontinued. That's something that we care a lot about. That's an area where cities and counties definitely do not think that is the law. They do not think that they need to put in the record all of the evidence they have for discontinuation of use. And we'll see how that shakes out on appeal. This case has already been appealed. La Cañada, and these next two cases I'll go through a little more quickly. These two cases, La Cañada and Hawaiian Gardens, are both rezoning cases, both just about the failure to comply with the rezoning deadline. There is a statutory bar. There's a provision in the government code that says if you adopt your housing element 1 year or more late, you simply cannot be in substantial compliance unless you have already done your rezoning. That means that there is no point in a city or county adopting a housing element over 1 year late unless they've already done their rezoning. There's just no point. We told these cities that. They did not believe us. They said that can't be the law. Housing elements are always supposed to come before rezoning. And 2 courts have now said, no, that is the law. La Cañada made a lot of the traditional you should defer to us, we are the city's arguments, and also argued that all of these standards were directory and not mandatory, and that courts couldn't enforce them. They also argued, although we hadn't really argued the opposite, that HCD's findings are not controlling. We don't particularly disagree. They just are what they are. The court rejected those arguments and importantly found that the deadlines, that due to recent legislative changes, the deadlines in housing element law are now mandatory and can be enforced in court. And found that Fonseca, which is an old case that had a lot to say about how housing elements are supposed to be enforced, is at least largely meaningless now. Hawaiian Gardens is a casino town, one of the cities that you may be aware of from Southern California that has a single or multiple industrial or commercial uses that basically pay all of the city revenues, and then the city uses those to provide services to a very small number of residents. In Hawaiian Gardens' case, they get 70% of their revenues from one casino and they have 25,000 residents. Those cities, and we've sued a few of them in the past, have a very, very strong incentive not to add housing, because then there would be more people to distribute the casino revenues to. They also argued that the rezoning rules are not enforceable. They said that it's because they're not ministerial, which is odd, and therefore are discretionary. I don't know what they were intending to argue there. They also argued that equities weighed against us winning because the casino revenues had been so low during the pandemic. And that was not an argument that they should have made before a Los Angeles County judge. The court, again, rejected their arguments and found that the equities did weigh in favor of a decision of granting the writ, and that case may or may not be appealed. The La Cañada case has also been appealed. So that's the trial level cases. I want to talk a little bit about some appellate wins or losses for housing that have come up recently. At the very end of 2022, we had the Save Livermore Downtown case, which affirmed a court that had required a bond for a petitioner to proceed with a quite meritless CEQA lawsuit. That bond, I think the bonds in some of these cases, you can correct me if I'm wrong, have been expanded in some recent legislation. The ability to get bonds for to really force CEQA plaintiffs to put money up before they can just file these lawsuits is a big deal for those of us who care about fighting against those anti-housing lawsuits. There's the Martinez versus Clovis case, which interpreted a number of pieces of housing element law. Importantly, the requirement for evidence of discontinuation of existing use did not apply to the city of Clovis. So that case is of limited value for most jurisdictions because that rule does apply to most jurisdictions. But it does set forward the standard that courts use now when they think about housing element issues in general. And ultimately, the court did find that the city hadn't complied with minimum density requirements that are applicable to certain parcels in housing element law. The Snowball case is the most disappointing of the cases up here. It severely limited Subdivision J4 of the Housing Accountability Act, which is supposed to require that if there's an inconsistency in the densities permitted in a general plan and zoning, that you go with the general plan density. The city of Los Angeles has a footnote in some of its community plans that says we declare these two things to be consistent if the general plan density is less restrictive than the zone density. And the court accepted that declaration, even though in that case, the general plan called for over 100 units on a parcel and the zoning only allowed like 12. However, that case is also of limited value because the court found, although they were really not correct, but the court found that the parties, or that the plaintiff had waived several arguments. Arguments that if another party was to make them would probably win the day, including rejecting arguments about the entire second sentence of Subdivision J4 because the court decided that they had not been made properly below. It's a really weird decision. And even more bizarrely, 2 of the 3 judges on that panel, 3 days later, issued the Yes in My Backyard versus Culver City decision, which is, at least from the perspective of housing advocates, an excellent decision determining that Culver City's reduction in FAR violated SB 330. The city had argued that, in part at least, that, and I should say, the city argued this to me and I chose not to sue them. So it was at least persuasive to some people that because they had expanded ADU opportunities while simultaneously reducing the FAR, there was more total housing that could be built on their parcels, and therefore that it was acceptable for them to reduce the FAR, and the court rejected that argument. So those are the big appellate decisions. Next year, I think some of our trial wins are going to turn into appellate decisions, hopefully that look more like the YIMBY case than the Snowball case. That's it for me.
Thank you both for that. I just want to kick off the Q&A portion of this. So I have a couple of questions I want to ask them about what to expect in 2024, and then we can open up the mic to the room to ask their questions, to ask your questions. Stephen, Matt, many of the jurisdictions that we've been talking about today have adopted housing elements, and so now we're moving forward towards housing element implementation. What do you foresee as the challenges in that process, from the legislative end and from the judicial end?
I can start. I think you know, it's harder, for whatever reason, it's harder to do zoning than general plan amendments than a housing element. It's even harder to amend the land use element than the housing element, because the anti-housing folks do not pay attention to the housing element process in the way that you would expect them to. And so you are starting to see, we saw this for the first time in South Pasadena. We have a settlement with South Pasadena. The city settled pretty early with us, represented by one municipal law firm, hired a new municipal law firm, and now the city has chosen to violate the settlement agreement by refusing to do the rezoning that is called for in the housing element that they adopted pursuant to our settlement agreement. Because when it came time to do the rezoning, people showed up and got pissed off, and I expect to see a lot of that happening. And so people kind of have asked, why are you bothering to go in and get these orders on rezoning and require the cities to rezone within 60 days if they're going to do it eventually anyway? And the answer is, a lot of them are really, really, especially staff at some of these cities, are really afraid to bring the rezoning portion to the city council and to the planning commission and deal with that backlash that's going to happen. So I think the rezoning is a huge piece of it, and we're going to file a lot more rezoning lawsuits.
On both sides of the table there, yeah, not to put you on the spot, but would it be to enforce the zoning requirements, or would it also be to potentially intervene and defend the zoning?
Well, we certainly would be happy to defend the rezoning against CEQA lawsuits. I will tell you, the best way to avoid a CEQA lawsuit on your rezoning is to have been sued by us and have lost, because then it's CEQA exempt. Not to say that anybody should be asking us to sue them, but I'm just saying. We definitely would be interested in being on that side of the table. Also, sometimes, you know, we catch wind, usually not directly from electeds, but sometimes we catch wind that it would be very helpful to have been ordered to do something. So we're happy to play that role too, and that role sometimes looks very adversarial and feels not very adversarial.
So if you're looking to get sued, Matt can pass out his business card after the fact. Stephen, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I'll just say from the state perspective, as I mentioned on a lot of these laws, enforcement is key, and the housing element process is a little bit separated from, you know, legislators' attention. And so, you know, the AG is taking a bigger role, HCD is taking a big role, but they've been somewhat inconsistent in, you know, where they're going to weigh in, whether they have the capacity to weigh in. And one thing we've heard now is that the AG's strike force it's funded by the general fund. And the Legislative Analyst Office just released a report this morning that we're looking at a $68 billion deficit. And so there's a question of whether, you know, these entities that are supposed to be out there enforcing this are even going to have the capacity to do that in the future. And so it's great that, you know, other parties are stepping up to do that. But I think, you know, thinking about long-term solutions to enforcement is also something we have to do.
Back to something that Stephen talked about in his, during his presentation about the conflict between coastal and housing law. I'm going to direct this to Matt, because Stephen's already kind of given his foresight on the legislative efforts. Do you see any efforts to try to resolve that conflict with the judicial branch?
You know, when people come to us with issues in especially fully coastal cities like Carpinteria or Coronado, although we have sued Coronado, we sued Coronado and lost for coastal reasons. It's hard because you think, okay, I have to deal with this extra piece of the law, and if my goal is to make law, having that extra piece there, if I'm trying to make law about housing elements, having the extra coastal piece can really interfere with that goal. So it hasn't been something that we've done a lot of in the past. Not that we've actively avoided it, but it's kind of a factor. I'd like to get involved in litigating against a coastal city or two. We just haven't quite had the opportunities happen yet. But it's gonna come up. It's going to come up, whether it's us or YIMBY Law or Cal HDF, which is the third organization that does this kind of work. Somebody's going to push the issue, I would expect in the next year, and we'll see some movement on it. But it's unclear to me exactly how it's supposed to work.
Got it. All right, last question, then we'll open up to the room. We're still seeing a housing logjam. What do we do to solve it? Stephen, you want to kick us off on that one?
Big picture, I do think that we need to step away from the case-by-case exemptions and start looking holistically at, how to remove these barriers on a bigger scale. I think CEQA is going to be part of that discussion. I really think ACA 1 and funding for local governments to do infrastructure is going to be a huge deal. This is just because I worked on impact fees in the legislature, and I'm sympathetic to where cities are, because they were really limited in the money that they can recover for infrastructure. And so you've got this downward pressure on the financial side from local governments who say, we can't approve more housing because we can't pay for it. We're already running a deficit. We can't afford the police and the fire and the roads and the water. And then they're very open to the arguments of maybe neighbors who don't want it. And so there's this just, no matter what we do, we're fighting against a downstream current if we can't afford to pay for the housing. And using impact fees is not an equitable or sustainable way to do it. And so I do really encourage folks to look at that ACA 1 coalition that's building, and I think that's going to be a sea change if we can get it passed.
For me, ministerial review, which cuts CEQA out of the picture, I mean, it's so funny hearing cities and counties complain about CEQA. You have the choice. You can make projects ministerial. That's your choice. Now you have to go through CEQA to make projects ministerial, but that's one time, and then you're done. So make projects ministerial. We just saw for the first time, I think, the rejection of an argument that a project that a city said was ministerial was not ministerial. There's a project in Manhattan Beach. Actually, one of the cases where a judge said we weren't allowed to intervene, where the opponents were arguing that the project was not ministerial because it was possible under state density bonus law to deny the project for health and safety reasons, therefore the project must be discretionary. And the trial court rejected that argument. But as things get more and more ministerial, you will have to deal with these growing pains of people making arguments like that. But look, cities and counties can make projects ministerial. And as we've learned from the housing element process, sometimes people don't pay great attention to that step of the process, and then they have no choice when a neighboring property owner wants to build something because it's ministerial, it's done. So I think that's the big deal. But I mean, we're in a very bad economic environment for development, so it may be a few years before things get built. Although, when the Sheets decision inevitably determines that most California impact fees are unconstitutional, maybe we'll see a run on the bank before cities and counties get around to fixing that.
Matt's hot take. All right, let's open it up to the crowd.
validate
Testing.
it. I don't know what it's going to look like.
Good morning. My name is Augustine. I'm with AB Design Studio. I just moved from New York City about a year ago to Santa Barbara. Don't sue me. Just wanted to ask you what you felt was the biggest legal hurdle for housing reform here in Santa Barbara.
You might know that.
In Santa Barbara in particular or statewide?
Santa Barbara.
Cost of property is really high, permitting slow, right? Environmental review. It kind of runs the gamut. That's something that we've talked about a lot at CHC over the course of this past year about innovative ways to streamline the housing development process in the county and the city. But as I kind of mentioned in my set the table introduction, it's going to take a lot of creative ideas to get there. So I don't think it's any one in particular thing. It's the whole regulatory environmental process.
If I could just add to that, this is not Santa Barbara specific, but I think it probably applies here, is one thing that we're seeing at the state level is you've got all these agencies, and this goes back to what Mr. Americano was saying about process, working in their silo and in their lane really well to try to do their job the best they can. We're dealing with an issue in the Bay Area about the local water board has imposed an inclusionary requirement on new housing. And they're connecting that because they're saying that homelessness causes water quality impacts, so they have the authority to require inclusionary zoning. But they think they're just doing the best they can for water quality. And then we've got the DTSC is doing new rules about moving dust around and dirt when you do a new development. And they've removed a cap on fees, so that some projects are going from a cap of like $50,000 to $15 million just to move the dirt to begin the project. And DTSC is just doing the best they can in its lane to try to protect the environment. But no one is coordinating these agencies on the impacts to housing. And so folks in the housing advocacy space are looking for maybe a bigger solution where if it's a housing czar, or if agencies have to take into account the impact on affordability when they make regulations, but some way that instead of having to fight each one of these battles, because there's no one issue that kills a project, it's just death by 1,000 cuts. And so to have someone kind of looking holistically at it, I think is something that we really need to think about.
Thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Kathleen Rogers. I am a professional with Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. When I was a kid, I used to walk with my grandfather. We could stand at the beach and we could see the mountains, and it was really important that we're that kind of a community where you can see the mountains. And I'm wondering, with housing density, how do we have fairness so we don't only put density maybe on the west side or the east side, but where we have fairness for all communities? So maybe State Street, Coast Village Road, and Hollister. So I just had a question about how do you balance density and fairness? Some communities maybe are Spanish speaking, and other communities maybe are more wealthy. So how do you kind of handle that? Because I think we do want housing in Santa Barbara. And also looking at urban housing versus taking farmland. I think also people might like having housing in like malls and things like that. So I just wanted to ask that type of question. Thank you.
Yeah, on the equity piece, I think that's a really good point. It's something that we actually spoke about at last year's conference. We had a professor from UC Merced come and talk about how there needs to be more development in each of the communities, not just one in particular. But what she noted in her data is that you actually have anti-growth in all of the communities that run the economic gamut. So I think it's a really good question. It's something that we need to problem solve. Part of that is ensuring that zoning in, perhaps every single, ensuring that there's housing opportunities in every single zoning district. So that's something that we have to deal with. You guys want to talk about that at the state at all?
Yeah, so for me, I think density is good and attractive. And so for me, some of the conversations about density in California simply make no sense. And I think they make no sense for a lot of people who have been in places where there's more density and it is very attractive. Seattle's a great example. So you know, sometimes the conversation is odd to me, but I will say we have conversations with people about, more traditional equity groups have focused more on big cities, forcing LA into a big consent decree that requires it to do X, Y, and Z that will be supervised by a court for 30 years. And I think one of the problems with that approach is that if you are a smaller jurisdiction, like say Bradbury, which we have a housing element settlement with, you've gotten away with not getting sued because the other organizations haven't focused on you. And that's part of why we have focused on, not necessarily focused on suburban jurisdictions, but we've gone into places where other people have not paid as much attention to what they're doing, because I think it's very important for equity reasons that everybody has to comply with these rules, and not just the cities that are traditional focuses for the big equity organization.
I'd also add to sort of the sprawl issue. The state has a host of goals through its climate action plan, and has passed a host of infill development streamlining bills and CEQA rules, vehicle miles traveled, in order to streamline that infill housing because it meets those climate action goals. So that's something that we have to consider as a community when we're talking about developing outside of the urban core. You know, those are considerations that we need to take into place. Any other questions? We stumped you, huh? All right, we're gonna call it. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Chris. Well done, panel. We are on another 15-minute break. So enjoy yourself, go to the restroom. We're gonna aim to restart at 11:45, and we'll see you then. Thank you. This will be the final segment of today's show. So we'll wrap you up by 12:30. Thank you.